Hi everybody. I guess today I'm going to speak about two different projects, both on the island of Ireland, but obviously the island is a divided island, so there are two quite different contexts in terms of speaking about asylum seekers and refugees. So the first project was a longer term, more academic project. It was a 2-year ethnographic project based in the Republic of Ireland, examining asylum seekers and refugees, well, predominantly post the asylum process, and looking at their sort of grassroots integration experience. And it was a very, very long, involved project. The second one that I want to talk about is a little bit more recent and I suppose quite different in terms of the fact that it was a tendered research project for the Northern Irish government, looking at the possibilities of developing a refugee integration strategy, because obviously in the Northern Irish context, having asylum seekers and refugees is something new, because it's not long, I suppose, in terms of their own history, that it's become a post-conflict society. So there are a lot of different kinds of issues there. So I suppose that the first project, I'm just going to give you kind of a cursory overview of the different kinds of things we looked at, and then I'll do a little bit of comparison with Northern Ireland. So just in terms of the context, for those of you who aren't aware, that's obviously the map, and the border is the green is the Republic of Ireland, and then the 6 counties are the north, and obviously there's a border, but it's a soft border, and that's part of the peace agreements, so people can move freely across that border, with the exception of asylum seekers and refugees who are criminalised for doing so. I suppose the other thing to note is there are two very distinct asylum and refugee systems. Obviously the Republic of Ireland has its own system, and in the north it's the UK system, and the border. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about this today because it's going to become more complex because of Brexit. I suppose the fear is with Brexit that we're going to have a hard border on the island, which will be problematic for everyone. In fact, so that's another issue, but. I suppose, and it will make life even more complex for the movement of migrants and asylum seekers and refugees around the island, especially for those living along the border. But it's a story for another day. So the system in Ireland is one of detention. So when asylum seekers arrive to Ireland and put in their claim, they are actually detained in places like this. This is an example of Mosney, one of our very large detention centres. They're called direct provision, and people spend years and years in these spaces. Obviously they're allowed mobility outside the centres, but they're not allowed to work. Their food is cooked for them, and they get a very small amount of money per week in which to live. Their children will go to schools in the local areas. So it's quite an abhorrent system, and there's a lot of campaigns in Ireland at the moment to try and get rid of this system. I suppose the project that we were looking at in terms of the anthropological ethnographic project was looking at how direct provision impacts on people's ability to integrate into Irish society. And at the time I was doing the research, it was about 2008, 2009, so the Irish economy had been booming. We had a lot of inward migration, and there was a lot of talk about integration. What is integration? What should it look like? And this idea of developing it. And I suppose I just want to stop here and also say to you that I find the concept of integration, or the language of integration, is obviously very, very, very problematic, and there's a lot of debate in the literature about that. We probably won't have time today to kind of discuss that, but So I suppose the focus of our project was what happens to people after asylum once they move through these places, they get their status, and the impact of having lived, or for children obviously growing up in these places. There were a range of issues. So we decided then to track people as they started their everyday kind of life experience and engagement in Ireland, and moving outside of these places. The research itself was located, so I do have a clip, I'll show you that if we have time, just so you can actually kind of visually see what one of these places look like. The focus of the first research project in the Republic of Ireland was on predominantly Nigerian and Congolese communities, because at the time of the research, these were the highest numbers of population seeking asylum in Ireland, and we focused in particular along the border towns between the north and the south, like Dundalk and Drogheda, but also in Dublin, because obviously that's a very, very different kind of dynamic there. And we were looking at, as I said, integration as something that was happening at the grassroots level, and looking at the experience of integration as opposed to what was happening at a policy level. But the premise of integration, which you see in the literature and in the policy literature, is this idea that integration should be a two-way process. So that's how I suppose I framed both projects, so that the onus is as much on the host community as it is on people seeking asylum or refuge, to think about what kind of values of integration or inclusion will make the society that we're living in a more equal society. So for the project, we focused on how people were integrating in different kinds of spaces. So those spaces were anything from the labour market to education, to politics, and we also looked at second generation issues as well. So it was quite an all-encompassing project, and within that we focused on sort of different elements. So I suppose in the context of labour integration in Ireland, asylum seekers are not allowed to work. So they're not allowed to work until they get their refugee status. So this isn't uncommon, obviously, across Europe. In that time period, there's obviously a lot of de-skilling and demotivation, and a lot of kind of things happen in that waiting period. And a lot of frustration and health issues, of course, as well. But upon getting a refugee status, I suppose what we found, and again this is not uncommon, but extremely high levels of precarity for refugees in the labour market in terms of integrating into it. Even though there are a lot of programmes in Ireland around training and so forth. And so what we found from the cohort of people we were working with was that a lot of male refugees were actually ending up working in the taxi industry. So we decided to focus actually on the taxi industry in Northern Ireland or in the Republic of Ireland, and the kinds of things that were happening in that space. And it was, I suppose, at the same time, during the boom, the Celtic Tiger in Ireland, what happened to the taxi industry was a deregulation of the taxi industry, and I suppose a surplus of taxi drivers. So we have far too many taxis in Dublin, and obviously not enough work. So you can imagine the competition, and so from there a lot of prejudice and racism and a whole range of issues that we dealt with in writing around this. But I suppose what we found too was, for refugees, they were just using the taxi industry as a way to earn money while they were upskilling or waiting for qualifications to be recognised. So they were just moving through that space, but at the same time there was a whole range of complexities arising from that. We also looked at political integration. The Republic of Ireland is quite unique in Europe in terms of, if you've been living there resident for a couple of months, you can actually vote in local elections and involve yourself in local elections, which is quite unusual. So what you do actually have happening at the sort of grassroots level is a lot of migrants and some refugees engaging in politics and running to become local councillors. So what we did was we tracked people ethnographically. So I I basically went out every evening with two ladies, one lady running for the Greens party and one lady, both Nigerian, one lady running for Fine Gael, which is kind of a centre-right party, and one of the main political parties in Ireland, and basically went on the campaign with them every night just to see the kinds of reactions they were getting from people and what was happening, and how, you know, and then tracked them right through until the elections. So neither women were elected, but actually both did exceptionally well in terms of the vote. So I suppose what we found more generally was obviously a need for better strategies of inclusion within main political parties, and that need for positive discrimination in politics extremely important. And I suppose migrants themselves organising at a number of levels in order to make that happen. And increasingly since 2009 we have a lot of very successful examples of people being voted into quite large political parties in the Republic of Ireland. I'm not going to get to talk about every aspect of it. We also, as I said, looked at education. Religion became something that was seemed to be very important, because in the direct provision centres, what you do have happening are African Pentecostal churches establishing themselves, I suppose kind of recruiting people converting, or people who are already there are Pentecostal. And so we wanted to examine the role that religion plays in integration, whether it does play a role or whether it makes things more complex for people, and I suppose I'm still sitting on the fence a little bit about the role that religion plays, and I suppose in the Republic of Ireland it's even more complex, because a very high percentage of our schools are actually still, they're not secular, they're still Catholic, so there's a whole range of complexities going on there, and we did focus on Pentecostal. This image here that you can see, sorry it's not a little bit bigger, what it actually says, it was a Jesus walk that I went on with a group of African Pentecostals from different churches, and it was right at the start of the recession in Ireland, and it just says that the image at the back says, "We have been sent to exterminate this recession," and it was just one of those moments where I was standing with a group of African Pentecostals, and they were praying, trying to pray for Ireland to move out of recession. So it was just one of those very interesting kind of ethnographic moments in terms of doing research. But as I said, the complexities of religion, there's an awful lot to be said around the role of religion in the Republic. I'm going to move on to talk about the Northern, because I'm just conscious of just time. Sorry. The Northern Ireland context, very different. Obviously, it's the UK system. It's a dispersal system in the UK. So when you come, say to London or wherever, you're dispersed to accommodation, maybe somewhere else in the north of England or somewhere else. But what's different about Northern Ireland is it's outside of the dispersal system. Okay, so people come there on their own accord. So sometimes they cross the border up from Dublin, they come on a boat, or they come in all different ways. So in the north and in the UK generally, asylum seekers are housed in private rental accommodation or social housing through a housing scheme and an asylum support system. And in the same as in the south of Ireland or the Republic of Ireland, asylum seekers are not allowed to work but are allowed to volunteer. So I suppose the project that I was working on was a very involved applied project, and I'm still not actually fully finished it. It was a qualitative research project to feed into the development of a refugee integration strategy. Northern Ireland does not have, I suppose, the supports or services, or has not had the supports or services in place until very recently, because obviously due to the conflict in Northern Ireland, they wouldn't have had people seeking asylum or a large migrant population in Northern Ireland. So I suppose the role for us in this particular project was to interview asylum seekers and refugees from as many nationalities as were there, to try and find out about their everyday life experience in Northern Ireland, and particularly how they interface or engage with service provision in Northern Ireland, and what were the gaps. And we also had to identify and speak to members of the NGO and charitable sector. There's a very active, vibrant, voluntary community kind of sector in Northern Ireland. I suppose that's a legacy of the conflict there as well, but they work very hard around the issues to do with migration. So we spoke to about 50 members of that sector and about 48 asylum seekers from 10 different countries. The highest number of asylum seekers in Northern Ireland come from actually China, interestingly, and Somalia and Sudan, so a different demographic to the Republic of Ireland. As I said, our focus there was on their everyday lives and engagement with service provision. I just want to say the numbers of asylum seekers and refugees on the island as a whole are quite small. Both the Republic of Ireland and the North of Ireland have signed up to accept programme refugees from Syria as well, but again the numbers are smaller than they might be elsewhere. I suppose, so what are the complexities of Northern Ireland? Northern Ireland is extremely a complex place to think about integration, because I suppose it's a divided society, and it's divided in all kinds of ways. So there were a number of questions about thinking about, is integration into a post-conflict society more complex than it might be in, say, the Republic of Ireland? And of course it is, yes it is. There are, one of the questions we asked asylum seekers and refugees, does the legacy of the conflict and the divisions that still obtain in Belfast, for example, which is where we did a lot of research, does that impact on you in terms of you not feeling free to move around the city? And they would answer yes, of course. So I suppose things like flag flying, so during July when there are marches and parading happening, you see a lot of flags, either Irish flags or British flags, but what you also see actually are Israeli flags or Palestinian flags, support on one side or the other. So there's I suppose different divisions going on in terms of their political allegiances, if you're a Republican or a Catholic, or if you're a Protestant and a Loyalist. So these complexities exist, and they exist across the different services that are provided as well, in terms of who feels comfortable accessing kinds of services. So I suppose Northern Ireland is still a deeply segregated society. Some communities are still quite sectarian, and I suppose it's into those underprivileged and sectarian communities that asylum seekers and refugees are actually housed. So then they're left dealing with sort of those challenges and those legacies of division as much as anything. So they are very particular obstacles. I haven't fully got around to answering all of these questions yet, because we're still kind of investigating it. So what are the main issues in Northern Ireland? Again, these are similar issues if you look at any research done right across Europe. And particularly in the UK, I want to add that housing for asylum seekers and refugees, well, asylum seekers in particular, has become heavily commercialised. So the Home Office contracts to a very large company, Serco is the name of the country the company that's in charge of housing for Northern Ireland and Scotland. Northern Ireland and Scotland are often kind of conflated in terms of asylum seeking and refugee processes. That very large company then contracts to another company, who then subcontracts to another company. So you can imagine that really complicates the chain of housing and being able to complain about your housing and the kinds of conditions that housing are in. So the commercialisation of asylum in general is a huge issue in the UK, and there's a lot of knock-on effects that we kind of encountered. Poor legal advice. Again, there's sort of very, I suppose, local particularities in the UK, in Northern Ireland, where asylum seekers aren't getting the correct legal advice, and so their claims are failing, and so on. And so there's an awful lot I could say about that. Increasingly, right across the UK, because of the commercialisation of housing, because of a number of other issues, there are very high levels of destitution of asylum seekers and refugees. So a lot of the people I interviewed actually were homeless and are sleeping in parks, and they'd fallen out of the system in all kinds of ways. I suppose one of the issues too that comes up is, if your country is on a list of countries to which you cannot be returned to, for example Somalia, because the conflict there is deemed still too challenging to return people to that country, and if your asylum claim fails, they cannot send you back, but you fall out of the system, you do not have any supports, you can't work, you end up homeless and on the streets. So there's a whole range of issues kind of attached to that. Again, in Northern Ireland we found very weak labour market integration, and I suppose the complexities of mental health, which obtained or pertain to both the Republic of Ireland because of being held for a very long time in a detention space. And I suppose in the south and in the north of Ireland, we do not have the appropriate resources in place to deal with mental health issues. I suppose in Northern Ireland, there are their own local issues around mental health to do with the conflict there, and they're also under-resourced. And they do not have any, I suppose, dedicated services for victims of torture in Northern Ireland. We do have only one service in the south, which again, these are all very important services that need to be addressed. And then of course the prejudice and complexities of living in a divided society. I'll wrap it up there actually. So just in terms of ways forward, I suppose there's an awful lot of debate about what policy can do and these kinds of frameworks, but I suppose actually after being involved at a very I suppose beginning level in Northern Ireland at the development of a refugee integration strategy there, I really do see the development of this kind of strategy and the involvement of the NGO, charitable, educational sectors being really important. I suppose just as setting out a pathway for what a particular society can do. And I suppose also the premise that this idea of integration, which if you look at some of the work done in Scotland, which is absolutely super, the Scottish Refugee Council has done some excellent work. They begin with this idea of integration as beginning on the day of arrival. So it's actually not when you get your refugee status. It should begin the minute you set foot in a particular country and you put your claim in, because there's all sorts of evidence to point to that's important that we think about that. So this notion of creating a more holistic, all-encompassing integration strategy that brings, I suppose, the different sectors and services together, which I suppose is I suppose might happen in an ideal world, but certainly in the Northern Ireland context, we're seeing an awful lot of very positive work where the different sectors are working together to make things better for people seeking asylum, at least in that context. So I'll let it there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fiona. I think we will hear another presentation and then maybe wrap all together with a discussion and questions if you're up for it. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, just some. I will use a few minutes to introduce. I didn't introduce properly Fiona because Jana already introduced you in Slovene, so I will just introduce my other two guests. It's Deirdre Figueiredo is actually director of the Craft Space, a craft development organization based in UK. She has been dedicated to the promotion of diversity and accessibility with the contemporary craft sector in Britain. Also, she has initiated Project Scelano in 2010, which is the developing craft social enterprise composed of migrant and refugee women who meet in Birmingham to decide and make jewelry to sell.